Namaste, India. This is Ralph Simon from TEDx Gateway, just about to introduce you to our really distinguished special guest today, who we will tell you about in just a minute. But for those of you that are not familiar with TEDx Gateway is India's largest ideas platform and one of the largest in Asia. Over the past 10 years, we've hosted over 300 speakers. We've gained over 400 million views and brought together thousands of people around the world to hear about what's coming next and ideas that are worth spreading. And this particular webinar, The World is Changing, aims to bring together experts, visionaries, and thought leaders across different fields directly to you in your home to create thought-provoking dialogues that are insightful and give you ideas for the future. So those of you that want to ask questions, we will be taking a Q&A session with our distinguished speaker today, Nir Eyal, who we'll introduce in just a moment. And so thank you all for tuning in today's sessions. We hope to bring you many more insightful conversations every weekend. And so as we start, we'd like to say something to all those of you who speak Hindi that are watching this. Dunya badal rahi hai, apne nazariye ko bhi badlo. The world is changing. Change the way you see it. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me very great pleasure today to present to you with our speaker, who is actually sitting in Singapore, although he usually is based somewhere between Silicon Valley and San Francisco. We'll just give you a little bit of quick background just before we introduce him. Nir Eyal was an Israeli-born American author, lecturer, and investor, and known for his best-selling books, Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, and his latest book, called Indistractable, which is how to control your attention and choose your life. Very, very important. And just a little bit of background. When Nir was only 3 years old, he and his family emigrated to the United States. He lived in Orlando in Florida for a while and then went to Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, to do a BA degree. He then worked for a while with Boston Consulting, the big consulting group, and also with a solar panel installation firm, believe it or not. And then he went to Stanford to do a master's degree. And after graduating from Stanford with an MBA, Eyal and his fellow students founded a company that placed online ads in Facebook. With Eyal serving as the CEO, his work in the company sparked his interest in the psychology of users because he'd qualified as a behavioral scientist, and he went on to become a consultant in product design, behavioral science, and a whole new interesting way of looking at the way social media interacts with people's lives. And he taught a course in the program on product design at Stanford University School of Engineering. So pretty amazing. His expertise is in behavioral engineering, which incorporates elements of behavioral science to enable software designers to develop habit-forming products for businesses. He's taught at university courses, given speeches, published books about psychology and how it intersects with technology and business. And on that note, we'd also like to welcome the many, we think, a few hundred executives from major corporations across India that are keying in today. We welcome a lot of executives from the Aditya Birla Group, from Reliance, from Tata, from Genesis, BCW, Facebook, Deloitte, ByteDance, Hiranandani Group, the British High Commission, Future Retail, Kotak Bank, Accenture. So we've got a very interesting crowd, plus you, the audience. And so this new book of Nir's is How to Control Your Attention, Choose Your Life, Indistractable. And so ladies and gentlemen, very, very warm welcome. Let's introduce Nir to the screen.
Thank you so much, Ralph. It's great to be here. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone joining us today. It's a real pleasure to be here. So Ralph, maybe it's helpful if I should give a little background on my research. Would that be helpful to talk about?
That'll be great.
All right, sure. So my background, my story really starts where several years ago, I started a business in the intersection of gaming and advertising. And I had this front row seat to see companies like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and WhatsApp and Slack and Snapchat all spring forth in Silicon Valley back in 2007, 2008, back when apps didn't mean iPhone apps. This was back in the day when apps meant Facebook apps. And many of my clients and friends in the Valley were building these companies that turned out to be really world-changing enterprises. And I saw many experiments come and go. I saw many companies, get very big, very quick. And some of them would burn out and others remained. And what fascinated me most about these companies was how they built habits. That really was very interesting to me. And I came up with a hypothesis that as screens shrink, right, as we went from desktop computers to laptops to mobile devices to now wearable devices, and even more recently when it comes to the Amazon Alexa, these auditory devices where there is no screen interface, that means that habits are increasingly important. Because if your customer doesn't remember to use your product or service, if you're not on the front screen of that smartphone, if you're not something top of mind for the customer to turn to with little or no conscious thought, your product might as well not even exist. Even for the reason that there just isn't the real estate to trigger people with the kind of what we call an external trigger, the ads, the messages, the pings and dings that there used to be, that the smaller the interface gets, the more important habits become. So I wanted to find where could I learn how to build habit-forming products, and I couldn't find such a book. And so I decided to blog about this and learn about how to design for habit-forming products. That's when I, after a few years of doing that, I was invited to teach at Stanford with a former professor of mine, Dr. Baba Shiv, a neuroscientist at Stanford, and taught a class with him for many years on behavioral design, then transferred over to the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford, where I taught what ended up being...
Hasso-Plattner is the founder of SAP.
Right. So the design school at Stanford, the D school, is named in his honor. And so from that class, my first book, I codified these techniques into my first book, Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. And the purpose of Hooked is to democratize the psychology behind what makes these products so engaging. I did not write Hooked for Facebook and the gaming companies and YouTube. They know these techniques and they've used them for years. My goal was to take that research and democratize it for everyone else, for people who are listening to me right now, who are building the kind of products and services that could improve people's lives if they only used the service. That as someone who started 2 companies, I know how difficult it is to change consumer behavior, even when it's for the consumer's own benefit. And so what I wanted to do was to take those techniques that make products like video games and social media and YouTube and all of these products I previously mentioned, and boil down what I call the hooked model so that we can build good habits with these products and services. And that's exactly what's happened in the past several years. Companies like Kahoot, the world's largest educational software, the company just went public a few months ago, they use the hook model to get kids hooked onto education. Companies like Fitbod
education is such a huge issue for India. There are many students watching you now, Nir, so that's a great line to expand on.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's companies, from in the education space, in the fitness, healthcare space. Companies like Fitbod use the hook model to get people hooked to exercise. I've worked with clients like the New York Times to get people hooked to engaging with the news every day. So we can use these tactics for good. We can use these products and services to build good habits in people's lives. And that's exactly what's happened in the 5 or 6 years now since Hooked has been published. Now, shortly after Hooked was published, I had an experience which made me reconsider my relationship with distraction. I was sitting with my daughter one afternoon, and we had this beautiful afternoon plan together. And we had this book of activities that daddies and daughters could play together. And one of the activities in this book was to ask each other this question, that if you could have any superpower, what superpower would you want? And I remember this question verbatim, but I can't tell you what my daughter said, because in that moment, I decided that it was a good time to just check this one thing on my phone And instead of paying attention to someone I love very much, I was sending her the message that whatever was on my screen was more important than she was. And she got the message, she left the room, and by the time I looked up from my device, she was gone. And I'd realized that I'd blown this perfect moment, this perfect daddy-daughter moment. I'd ruined it. And if I'm honest with you, it wasn't just with my daughter. I got distracted when I would sit down at my desk and I'd say, I'm going to work on that big project. I'm going to stop procrastinating. I'm not going to get distracted. And yet 15, 20, 30 minutes later, I was not doing the thing I said I was going to sit down and work on. I would say I was going to eat right. I would say I was going to exercise, and yet I wouldn't do it. And so I wanted to understand what was the deeper psychology behind why we get distracted. That if Hooked was all about how to build good habits, I wanted to understand and work on this research, the other side of the coin of how do we break the bad habits. And one of the first things I learned was that this is not a new problem. That in fact, Plato, the philosopher, talked about distraction 2,500 years ago, that as much as we love to blame these devices, Plato was talking about how distracted people were 2,500 years before smartphones and Facebook and WhatsApp and all these tools that we think is the cause of distraction. That in fact, nothing could be further from the truth, that the problem of distraction is nothing new. And so in fact, Plato called this akrasia, the tendency that we all have to do things against our better judgment. And Plato wondered, why is this exactly? If we know what to do, why don't we just do it? And if this was something that Plato observed 2,500 years ago, I think it's even more of an interesting question today, because at least, in our parents' or grandparents' generation, they could argue, well, I don't know, right? You could say a few generations ago that you didn't have the information. The information was scarce. But today, who doesn't know how to lose weight, right? Who doesn't know how to excel at your job? Right? Who doesn't know how to have better relationships? You be present with people you're with, right? We all know what to do. And if you don't know how to do this stuff, Google it. It's all just a quick search away. So today we no longer have the excuse that we don't know what to do. We all know basically what to do to achieve our goals and live the kind of life we want. The question is not what information are we lacking? We're swimming in information. The question is, why don't we do the things we know we should do? Why do we get distracted? So the model I wanted to offer up, my contribution to this field after 5 years of researching this question that Plato raised of why don't we do what we say we're going to do, is what I call the Indistractable model. And here's how it works. The first place to understand how to become indistractable is to understand what really is distraction. So think for yourself for a minute. If I asked you, what is the opposite of distraction? What is the opposite of distraction? Most people will say the opposite of distraction is focus. But I actually don't think that's the case. That the opposite of distraction is not focus. The opposite of distraction is traction. That if you look at the origin of both words, they both come from the same Latin root, trahare, which means to pull. And you'll notice that both words, traction and distraction, end in the same 6 letters, A-C-T-I-O-N, that spells action. So traction is any action that pulls you towards what you want to do, things that you do with intent, things that move you closer to your values and help you be the kind of person you want to become. The opposite of traction is distraction, any action that pulls you away from what you plan to do, that is not in accordance with your values, things that you are not doing with intent. So why is this dichotomy so important? Why do we start here? Because I argue anything can be a distraction and anything can be traction. Let me give you a great example. How many times have you sat at your desk, as I used to do before I embarked on this line of research? I would sit down at my desk and I say, okay, now I'm going to get to work. I'm going to stop procrastinating. I'm not going to get distracted. I'm going to work on that big project. I'm going to stay focused. Here I go. I'm going to get started right away. Here I go. But first, let me check some email. Does that sound familiar to anyone? It's happened to me all the time. It used to happen constantly to me, right? Because I would think, well, that's a productive thing to do. I need to check email. I need to check that quick Slack channel. I need to do that one quick thing on my to-do list. And what I didn't realize is that I was allowing distraction to trick me, to fool me into prioritizing the urgent at the expense of the important. And this is the most pernicious form of distraction. It's not Facebook, it's not YouTube, it's not WhatsApp. Those are obvious distractions. If you're playing a video game when you say you're going to do some work, well, that's pretty obvious that you're slacking off. That's not the most dangerous form of distraction. The most dangerous form of distraction is the one we don't realize is distracting us. It's the things that feel productive that make us prioritize the urgent at the expense of the important. So any action can be a distraction. And conversely, any action can be traction. So, there's many people out there who want to sell you this line that technology is addicting everyone, that it's hijacking our brains, that it's doing all this bad stuff to us. And I would posit that, one, the research is horrible, that the research does not show this is the case. And furthermore, it's really easy for some professor who doesn't have a social media account to tell us all to stop using social media and stop checking email. The fact of the matter is that if we stop using these devices, most of us will get fired, right? We need this for our livelihood, and there's no good reason to stop using it. The key is to turn distraction into traction. How do we do that? One word. And that one word is intent. You see, the time you plan to waste is not wasted time. So there's nothing wrong with enjoying social media. There's nothing wrong with watching a movie. There's nothing wrong with enjoying a cricket match or whatever it is that you want to do with your time. It's all wonderful, as long as you do it on your schedule, not the tech company's schedule, not what somebody else wants you to do, but what you yourself plan to do in advance. Okay, so we've got traction. We've got distraction, these two actions that move us either closer to our values or away from what we really want to do. Now, the next two parts of the Indistractable model have to do with what prompts us to these actions, what we call triggers. And we have two types of triggers. We have external triggers. External triggers are the pings, the dings, the rings, all of these things in our outside environment that can lead us towards traction or distraction. And this tends to be the usual suspects, right? We blame email, we blame our phones, we blame all of these external triggers in our environment. And we're going to get to what we do about those external triggers. But actually, what I found in my research, and I was quite surprised by, is that the leading cause of distraction is not what is happening outside of us, but rather distraction begins from within. And this is going to be surprising to many people. That in fact, what's called the internal triggers are the most prevalent source of distraction, that distraction tends to begin from within. What are internal triggers? Internal triggers are uncomfortable emotional states. You see, if we are going to answer Plato's 2,500-year-old question of why do we do things against our better interests, we actually have to ask ourselves a more fundamental question, which is, wait a minute, why do we do anything and everything? What's the nature of human motivation? Ask yourself, why do we do what we do? Most people think that the answer to that question is that everything humans do is about carrots and sticks, right? I'm sure you've heard this in one form or another. It's about the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Sigmund Freud called it the pleasure principle. What we now know is that from a neurological basis, that is not true. That what drives human behavior is not the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, but rather one thing drives every single action you take. And that one thing is the desire to escape discomfort. Everything you do is about a desire to escape discomfort. Physiologically, we know this to be true, and it's common sense. It's called the homeostatic response. Think about it. If you go outside and it's cold, the brain says, oh, this isn't comfortable, put on a coat. And if you come back in, now you're too warm, the brain says, this doesn't feel good, take the coat off. If you feel hungry, you feel hunger pangs. And if you eat too much, oh, now you feel stuffed, the brain tells you to stop eating. So these are physiological sensations that prompt us to action. And the same holds true to our psychological sensations. So let me ask you, when we're feeling lonely, where do we go? We check Facebook, we check WhatsApp. When we're feeling uncertain, what do? Well, we Google. And what do we do when we're feeling bored? Well, there's lots of solutions to take care of this uncomfortable internal trigger of boredom. We check the news, we check stock prices, we check sports scores, we check Reddit, Pinterest. I mean, you name it, lots and lots of solutions to this uncomfortable internal trigger of boredom. So what this means, therefore, if all human behavior is prompted by a desire to escape discomfort, even the desire for pleasurable sensations. I know what many of you are thinking, well, what if I desire to feel good? Well, even desire, wanting, craving, lusting, there's a reason we say love hurts. All of that desire is in fact psychologically destabilizing. The reason we want things, that feeling of desire, is itself uncomfortable. And so if all human behavior is prompted by a desire to escape discomfort, that therefore must mean that time management is pain management. Let me say that again. Time management is pain management. You see, I've read pretty much every book there is on productivity and life hacks and time management. And let me tell you, none of that stuff works. None of it works unless you first and foremost start with understanding and mastering the internal triggers. Because if you can't cope with and handle that psychological discomfort in a healthier manner, you will always get distracted by one thing or another. It's not a character flaw, distraction, procrastination. There's nothing wrong with you. It's not a character flaw. It's simply an inability to deal with uncomfortable sensations in a healthier manner. Distraction and procrastination is an emotion regulation problem, which is why we need to arm ourselves with techniques that can help us cope with that discomfort in a healthier manner. So now we have the 4 parts of the Indistractable model. I'll wrap it up so we can take some questions. So now we have at the top, right? We have the internal triggers and the external triggers pointing us outwards towards traction or distraction. So the first step is master the internal triggers. And we can talk about how we do that. Lots of techniques that I describe in Indistractable in the book. We can also talk about some of those today. The next step is to make time for traction. We talked about how our actions can go one of 2 directions, towards traction or towards distraction. So we want to make sure we make time for traction in our day. That's step 2. Step 3 has to do with those external triggers. It's called hacking back those external triggers. And I use that term very deliberately. You know, in computer hacker parlance, to hack means to gain unauthorized access to something. And it is clear that there are many people in the world today who want to gain unauthorized access to your attention. There's a reason we call it paying attention, because we are paying something when we give someone our attention. There is value in our attention. It's called paying attention for a reason. And so just like we wouldn't throw out money to anybody, we wouldn't pay them without getting some kind of value in return. We should understand what we are paying when we pay attention. And where a product is not serving us, where a ping, a ding, a ring is not serving us, where we are serving it, we must hack back those external triggers. So as much as people will tell you that technology is hacking our brains and hijacking our willpower and addicting us, I'm here to tell you we are much more powerful than those tech companies, and we can actually hack back their external triggers so that their products serve us as opposed to us serving them. And finally, the last step after we've done the other 3 is to prevent distractions with pacts. And this is where we use an ancient technique called making a pre-commitment, that as the last resort, as the firewall to getting distracted, we have a barrier in place to make sure that when we feel the urge to get distracted, there is something in our way. And we can talk about these 3 types of pacts: effort pacts, price pacts, and identity pacts, that make sure that we stay on task, do what we want to do, control our attention, and choose our life. And so with that overview, Ralph, happy to take some questions.
Well, I had an eargasm listening to that. This was really terrific. I hope our audience got it too. And Nir, we've got some very, very interesting questions, and some of them revolve around this particular subject, which we'd like to also ask you about. And it's this: how do we raise indistractable kids? A big issue with many parents. Here is a question coming from Sonal Ambani from Ahmedabad. Sonal, great that you sent this question, a good question. How do I get my kids and husband off the phone? All 3 are addicted to it.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So in Indistractable, half the book is about what you individually can do for yourself to become indistractable. And let me tell you, the answer that many people don't want to hear is that if we want our kids to be indistractable, if we want our employees to be indistractable, you know what? We have to be indistractable. You cannot tell your children, stop playing that video game while you're checking Facebook and email. It doesn't work. You see, children, I don't know if you knew this, Ralph, but children come from the womb with what we call a hypocrisy detection device. They have this built in. They are constantly scanning for hypocrites. And if you are a hypocrite, they love to call you out. And they instantly don't hear a thing you say if you are not walking the walk. Okay, you can't just talk the talk. So the best thing you can do to raise indistractable kids is to be indistractable yourself. So that's what the first half of the book is about, how to be indistractable yourself, those 4 steps that we discussed. But that's just half the book. The other half of the book acknowledges that as good as we are at becoming indistractable ourselves, that we operate in various contexts in our life. And so the second half of the book is about the various environments we operate in. So how do we raise indistractable kids, which I'll get to in a minute? How do we have an indistractable workplace, right? Think about this. If you're indistractable, but your boss insists on calling you at 9 p.m. on a Friday night, well, what do you do then, right? You've done everything right, but yet your boss is calling you. We can talk about that as well if there's interest around what do you do when someone else is distracting you, right? Even if you are indistractable, what if your company culture is such that you are constantly interrupted? We can talk about that. And then the last section of the book is about how do you have indistractable relationships? What happens when we go out for lunch or dinner and people around the table think it's a good time to check their phone when what we really want to do is to be together? So what do we do in those various situations? So let's start one at a time with this question on a lot of people's minds. How do we raise indistractable kids? Now, we talked about the best thing you can do is to become indistractable yourself, to be an indistractable parent. But let's dive into the problem a little further. So now that we understand the basic framework of these 4 basic steps of master internal triggers, make time for traction, hack back external triggers, and prevent distraction with pacts, I want to talk about step 2, 3, and 4, and then come back to 1 in a minute. Is that okay, Ralph? If we kind of bounce around the model, and I'll tell you why, because the step 2, 3, and 4 are pretty easy to do. So I want to run through those very quickly, but then I want to spend a little bit more time with step number 1 around understanding our kids' internal triggers. So stick around for that. The simple steps, step number 2, for example, is about making time for traction. Now, one of the things that many parents don't realize is that by not putting the things that children like on their schedule, they make them want it more. So making time for traction we understand that if we decide in advance what we want to do, we are turning distraction into traction. So there has not been even one study, not one, that shows that 2 hours or less of extracurricular age-appropriate screen time has any negative effects on children. Okay, so you can take a deep breath, parents. It's okay, 2 hours or less of age-appropriate content, whether that's videos, whether that's an app, whether that's a video game, is not going to hurt your children as long as it's age-appropriate for 2 hours or less. So what I want you to start doing is to take this advice of putting those actions on a calendar. How do we do that? We turn our values into time. Okay, we turn our values into time. By the way, this is advice that we as adults should follow as well. So when my daughter was just 5 years old, we sat down with her. And by the way, when my daughter was this age, this was just a little while after the iPad had come out. And we constantly heard her saying, iPad time, iPad time, iPad time. That was like her second words after she learned how to say daddy. She learned how to say iPad time, and it was driving us crazy. So we sat down with her. At 5 years old, we could do this. And we said, look, honey, the cost of all this iPad time is not, we don't want to scare our children, right? We want our children to be tech literate. We all understand the jobs of the future are going to require children to be comfortable with technology. So don't scare your kids with this rubbish that technology is bad for them. It's not bad for them. If you tell them that, they're not going to use it when they need it. Instead, what we want to say is the truth, that the cost of too much time on a screen is an opportunity cost. It's time doing other things. Time being with your friends, time going outside to play, time being with mommy and daddy, time with other forms of media like a book. That's the cost. And so we simply asked our daughter, honey, how much time would you like to spend on the iPad? What's good for you? Given all the other things you want to do, spending time with us, spending time with your friends, how much time would you like to spend on the iPad? And I was expecting her to say all day, but that's not what she said. You know what she said? She said 2 episodes. Now, 2 episodes on Netflix, she was talking about Netflix shows. That's what mostly she was doing at the time, is about 45 minutes. Well, that's well below the guidelines of 2 hours per day. So I have no problem with 45 minutes. And you know what we did? We scheduled that time for her and we put her in control of monitoring her time. Because here's the thing, parents, that many parents forget that we are not raising children. We are raising future adults. And so if you come down with very strict rules and tell your kids, here's what you have to do, and I'm going to tell you how much time you get on your iPad, as opposed to involving them and giving them agency and control over that discussion, you know what they're going to do? They're going to cheat. We're raising and incentivizing cheaters when we do that. When they go to their friend's house, when they leave the house and go to university, they're going to find ways to indulge. We want to help them build this muscle of self-control, of self-moderation now before they leave the house. So we put that on a schedule and we said, okay, this is the time when you're going to have the ability to watch a show as long as it's age appropriate, or play an app or play a game. But how do you make sure that you will keep track of that time, that 45 minutes? Well, she said, you know what, Daddy, we have this microwave. At the time, we had this microwave that was below, it was below the countertop. And she said, what if I walk up to the microwave and I'll put in how many minutes? I'll put in 45 minutes on the timer of the microwave. And then when it beeps, I'll stop. And so she became responsible for it. It's not Big Bad Daddy that has to say, time to get off your device. She's moderating her own behavior. Now, actually, there's tools built in. They weren't available at the time, but now there are tools built into her iPad that shut off for her automatically. But she is the one setting that guideline, not Daddy. It's her moderating her own behavior. And this is a critical skill. So now she's 11 years old, almost 12, and she still abides by the same restrictions that she herself set. Okay, so that's all about making time for traction. And by the way, parents, do not interrupt them during that time. If they want to play an hour of video games and they plan that time for themselves in advance, don't be the distraction, right? You can be the external trigger yourself. So let's go to the next step, hacking back the external trigger. There's a few simple rules that it comes to children that I think are very, very important. Number one, we do see that there is an increased rate of some psychological disorders recently, right? More depression, more anxiety. Now, people will attribute that to technology. But I think that is the symptom, not the cause. That the deeper, what we really see is going on is that much of this stuff is attributed to a lack of sleep. And so one very simple thing you can do, there's a lot more in the book that I advise doing, but what I want every parent to hear this right now is that everything that pings or dings does not have a place in your children's bedroom. I hate to say it, it doesn't have a place in your bedroom either. That includes old technology too, radio, television. If you sleep next to your cell phone every night, that's going to be the first thing you pick up in the morning and the last thing you look at night. Leave that stuff outside, especially for the children. They do not need these technologies in their rooms. They're wonderful technologies, but not if they interrupt sleep. So that's a way we can remove the external triggers. Another thing we can do is to prevent distraction with pacts, that final fourth step around preventing distraction with pacts. So one thing we can do is to teach our children to utilize what's called an effort pact, that there are thousands of free tools that we can use that children starting from age 5 can learn how to use, that they can set the time that they are allowed to use various devices. So we talked about how many of these tools are actually built into devices today. I want to show you a product that I use all the time. It's a free product called Forest. Here's how it works. I'll show it to you right now. So my daughter loves this app. You see, here's the app. It's a little tree, okay, a little virtual tree. And I put in how much time I want to do focused work for, or for my daughter, how much time she wants to play and watch a video or play a video game. She says, okay, 45 minutes. When she hits plant, if she picks up the phone and does anything with it that is not what she planned to do, let's say she's got time to do homework, for example. She needs to do homework for 45 minutes. And her phone is a source of distraction. So by making this pact in advance, if she picks up the phone and does anything with it for that time she has decided to do her work, the little cute virtual tree dies, okay? And so you don't want to be a virtual tree murderer. So it's enough of an incentive, enough of a reminder to tell you, oh, that's not what I want to be doing with my time right now. By the way, I use this every day when I do my writing, which is difficult, right? I'm oftentimes tempted towards distraction. I use that app every single day to make that pact. Okay, so those are the 3 relatively easy steps.
Right.
The most important step though, yeah, Ralph.
Now, just finish this thought because I've got a couple of things I want to specifically ask you.
Okay, so so I went step 2, 3, 4 first because those are relatively easy. There's a lot more tactical steps. But here's the big insight. If we want to understand why kids overuse technology, remember, use is not a problem, overuse is a problem. So if we want to understand why we, as well as children, overuse these devices, we have to dive deeper into some psychology. And what we find is that when people do not get what they need psychologically offline, they look for these things online. This is called the needs displacement hypothesis. So what are people looking for that they're not getting offline, that they're looking for online? There's some wonderful research that's called self-determination theory. This is the most widely accepted theory of human motivation and flourishing. It's over a 40-year-old theory. Every psychologist on the face of the earth has heard of it. Very well-known theory, very well scientifically supported. And self-determination theory says that every person on the earth needs 3 things to flourish. I call these psychological nutrients. Just like we have physical nutrients, we have carbohydrates, fat, and protein, the 3 macronutrients. We also have these 3 psychological nutrients. And here's what they are. The first one is competency. We need a sense that we are good at something. It feels good to get good at a task, right? So if you like public speaking, it feels good when you master it. If you're good at a sport, it feels good to get better at it. If you learn how to parallel park, there is joy in that sense of mastery. Here's the problem, that in many countries today, I know in my country, in the United States, this has certainly been a big problem. And I know many countries that emphasize education. I know India is a country that really prioritizes education. But recently we see, I think, the wrong type of tools used in education. Specifically, I'm referring to standardized testing. That we have seen an increase in standardized testing around the world. And so there is, in the United States, we have kids in 1st and 2nd grade being tested 5, 6 times a year with these standardized tests. And so what kind of message are kids getting if they're constantly hearing you're not competent, right? Well, where do they go to feel competent? They go online. They go to Roblox. They go to World of Warcraft. They go to these games that make them feel competent. The next psychological vitamin is called autonomy, that we need the sense of feeling in control. We need a sense of agency in our lives. But today, kids are more scheduled than ever. This is the most overscheduled generation in history because at school, in classroom learning, kids are told where to go, what to think, what to wear, who to be friends with. There's only 2 places you're allowed to do this to people in society, and that's school and prison. And so it's no shocker that when kids come home, they want freedom, they want to play. But today, kids are so overscheduled that they have no time for that play. And so where do they look for that sense of autonomy and freedom? They go online, right? They go into games that make them feel free. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, is what we call relatedness, that all of us need to be understood and to have others understand us. But when kids don't have proper time for free play, which we know is on a global decline, that children today have less time to just be kids. They're so scheduled with test prep and language learning and all this stuff that occupies their time. They have less time to just socialize. So where do they go? Oh, they go on TikTok, they go on Instagram, they go on Snapchat because they just want to be with their friends. It's no different from what we used to do a generation ago on the telephone. And so we have to make sure that kids have enough of these 3 psychological nutrients of competency, autonomy, and relatedness. This is the most important thing you can do for your child's psychological well-being. This is why we have such a fragile generation these days, that once they get into the working world, they crumble because they haven't had their psychological needs met. And so what are they doing? They're going online to get what they're not getting offline. And so it's much more important to make sure we understand why they overuse before we just say, oh, it's all technology's fault, get rid of it. That gets us nowhere. And by the way, this is something that parents have always done, right? We blamed rock and roll music. We blame the radio. We blame the television. We always do this. And it's never about the distraction. It's about what's going on inside. It's about the deeper reasons why someone would seek a distraction in the first place.
Great. So Nir, here are a couple of things that we'd like to just give some focus to. First of all, you've mentioned about the importance and responsibility of your company or your workplace. Now, Slack is an interesting company in Silicon Valley that have actually brought some of these very lessons into the workplace. I want you to speak very briefly about that. And
Sure.
then secondly, we've got a number of questions. We've got people from all over India that are keen to ask you some questions.
Yeah.
And one of which is a question by a well-known innovator in India by the name of Vishal Gondal. I don't know if Vishal can hear this, but he was interested as to whether you feel there's an evil in behavioral design, and also whether you are familiar with Tristan Harris, who is one of the great authorities on the use of this. And then thirdly,
wait, one at a time. I can't keep this all straight. These are
we'll take
one to start with.
So first of all, on Slack, we'd want to ask you about Slack, because that's a company that has really built this into their environment at work.
Right.
We'll come to the question a little afterwards. And just a whole notion of scheduling and schedule making. So let's talk about Slack to begin with.
Sure. So here's the thing. So, many of us, the knee-jerk reaction, and this relates to your question around, is it the technology that's really the problem? That was kind of my, that was my initial perspective. After I wrote Hooked, I said, oh my goodness, I'm getting distracted. Did I help let out Pandora's box here, right? Isn't it technology's fault? Look, we're all using technology too much, right? And this is what Tristan Harris and I disagree, is that, it's so easy to blame the technology. And the more research I did, the more I discovered it's not the technology. Let me give you a perfect example. Your boss calls you up. I said this earlier. Your boss calls you up at 9 p.m. on a Friday night, okay? You're having dinner with your family. Is it the telephone that your boss used to call you that's at fault? Of course not. It's the fact that your company has the kind of culture that permits those type of interruptions. And so what I discovered in my research, 5 years of research into this problem of distraction, is that the problem of distraction in the workplace is a symptom of cultural dysfunction. If you can't talk about the problem of distraction, if you feel like you're constantly pulled from one thing to the next and you can't focus on one project at a time, you can't do your work properly because you're constantly interrupted, I got news for you. That's the canary in the coal mine. You have all kinds of other cultural issues at your company if you can't talk about this problem, because the problem of distraction is that we can't talk about the problem of distraction in the workplace. And I'll give you evidence of this. One of the technologies that I heard was most distraction, the number 2 most distracting technology when I surveyed people. Number 1, by the way, this will be no surprise, was email. Number 1 distraction technology was email. Actually, the number 1 distraction was other people at work. That was the number 1. 80% of survey respondents said number 1 source of distraction was other people tapping you on the shoulder when you're trying to do something that requires focus. Number 2, the technology was email. Number 3 was group chat. So there's many group chat apps. One of the biggest is Slack. Now, Slack is this product that people blame for distracting them. So I went to pay them a visit. I went to Silicon Valley and I walked into the headquarters of Slack, and I expected, if it's the technology that's doing it to us, well, nobody uses Slack more than Slack. They should be the most distracted company on earth. Right. But that's not at all what I found. Right. That in fact, when you walk into Slack headquarters in San Francisco, you will see a big neon sign written on the wall in bright pink letters that says, "Work hard and go home."
Wow.
Work hard and go home. It's part of the company ethos that Stuart Butterfield on down, the CEO on down, has this culture. They have built this culture that they understand that to get people to do their best work, they need time to be indistractable. So it's not an issue of technology, it's an issue of culture. And I show people exactly how to change that culture. There are 3 dominant traits of companies that are indistractable. And the good news is we can change that company culture.
Very good. Slack thing. The next thing, I'll just bring you a question that we've got. Let's just have a look at something that is an interesting one. Here's one from Sai Kiran, and Sai is sending this to us from Medipali Upal. Can the principles of your book Hooked be applied to physical product design?
Absolutely, yeah. So any product that is used with sufficient frequency can incorporate these tactics to make the product habit forming, whether that's online, offline, doesn't matter, as long as it has these 4 basic parts of the hooked model, which we didn't talk about. We've been talking about Indistractable. So that's a whole nother conversation. Maybe I'll come back and walk everyone through the 4 steps of the model. But for the sake of time, the answer is yes, as long as it is used with sufficient frequency and the user finds sufficient value in it. One important thing to understand, and anyone who's built product understands this, that it's very difficult to change customer behavior, that the techniques of behavioral design are not, putting people's minds on a string. People are not puppets. People are not stupid. You have to give them value. What behavioral design is good for is helping people do things they want to do, but for lack of good product design currently don't do. So as long as the product adds value to the user's life and is used with sufficient frequency is very, very important. It's almost impossible to change a consumer habit if the behavior does not occur with sufficient frequency. But it doesn't matter if it's enterprise, offline, online, physical product, online product, doesn't matter. As long as it meets those 2 criteria, you can turn it into a habit.
Here's a question from Amit Batra. Amit Batra is in Noida. Amit asks you, how can we prevent stress from diverting our attention?
So this is a really important question, because he's getting to one of these internal triggers, which is incredibly important. This is step 1 to becoming indistractable, is mastering the internal triggers. So whether it's boredom, uncertainty, loneliness, fatigue, stress, anxiety, we have to understand that that is the trigger for us to seek escape, whether it's too much news, too much booze, too much football, too much Facebook. All of these distractions originate with the internal triggers. So there's many, many tactics I talk about in the book. One of the techniques that I use all the time, which I'll share with you quickly because I think everyone can use it starting today, is called the 10-minute rule. Now, the 10-minute rule says, and this is a technique that's been around for a long time. I didn't make it up. It comes from acceptance and commitment therapy. The 10-minute rule says that we can give in to any distraction, okay? Whether it's that piece of chocolate cake you shouldn't have, whether it's that cigarette you shouldn't smoke, whether it's checking email or Google when you really want to work on that big project, you can give in to that distraction in 10 minutes, okay? Not right now, in 10 minutes. Now listen carefully, not for 10 minutes. Some people confuse this and say, oh, I can smoke for 10 minutes. No. In 10 minutes, not for 10 minutes. Now, what this means is for those 10 minutes, here's what I want you to do. I want you to either focus on whatever it is you said you wanted to do at that time, or explore that sensation with curiosity rather than contempt for just 10 minutes. So what I do many times, so I've written 2 bestsellers now. I've written countless articles. And let me tell you, writing is never easy. It's really hard. It's full of these internal triggers of boredom and uncertainty. Is anybody going to like this work? I'm constantly feeling these internal triggers. And all I want to do is just go Google something or just check the news or check my email. So what I'll do is I'll take out my phone and say, set the time for 10 minutes. I'll put my phone down. And my job now is to either continue with the writing or to just sit there for a minute. Understand what is it that I'm feeling, right? What is this? What is that sensation that I'm experiencing? And my only 2 options are to either fix the source of that discomfort, so fix whatever is causing that stress in this case, or learn a tactic to cope with it. And sometimes simply acknowledging it, simply writing it down is an incredibly effective step to dealing with this discomfort. Because the way these internal triggers work, we think that a feeling is going to be around forever, but it never is. And more so, this is very important, we do not have responsibility for what we feel or the urges we experience. Many people don't understand this. You cannot control your feelings. You can only control how you respond to those feelings. So for example, if you feel the urge to sneeze, right? You can't control the urge to sneeze. You already have the urge. It's not in your responsibility. All you can do is to control how you respond to that urge, hence the word responsibility. So when we feel, for example, stress, do we look for escape? Do we check email? Do we check the news? Do we check stock prices? Do we go on Facebook? Or do we acknowledge, okay, I'm feeling stressed. Now, how can I use that internal trigger to drive me towards traction rather than distraction? And if at the end of those 10 minutes, you still want to give into that urge, fine. What you will find is if you use this technique, that 9 times out of 10, by the time that alarm goes off and the 10 minutes have elapsed, the sensation is gone. You no longer desire that thing. You're back doing the thing you really wanted to do.
Here's a question from Kapil Sani from Navi in Mumbai. And he asks this actually quite an interesting philosophical question. Am I living a social life, or are social apps living me? And this is a conflict that a lot of people in India have, where they feel they're imprisoned to, it's what you'd said about email. What's your sense about this question of whether he feels that the social apps are living him or he is living them?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So it sounds a little bit like the key question we have to ask ourselves, which I mentioned earlier, of is the external trigger serving me or am I serving it? So if I get a notification on my phone and it helps me remember that, oh, it's time to go exercise, it's time for that meeting, it's time for that phone call, whatever it might be, now it's leading me towards traction. But if I'm with my daughter and now I get this ping or ding on my phone, now it's leading me towards distraction. So the key here is to plan your day. You see, most people who are, using a productivity system, they're using to-do lists. And I'm going to kill a sacred cow right now and tell you that to-do lists are destroying your productivity. That, when I ask most people, actually 100% of the people who I've ever asked this question to, see what you all listening would say for yourself.
Right.
When was the last time you didn't finish everything on your to-do list?
Oh my goodness. Oh.
Okay, it's Ralph, let's ask you. Okay, I'm taking a chance here because I have no idea what your answer is going to be. When was the last time that you had your to-do list and you did not finish every single thing on that to-do list? When was the last time?
Oh, but it's a constant issue, particularly because there's so much. I wish I could have a schedule maker.
Thank you. Thank you. Everyone whom I ask this to, and we've all been told this orthodoxy that to get things done because some guru wrote a book about it, it's all about to-do lists. But everyone I ask and I say, well, how's that working for you? Do you do everything on your to-do list? When was the last time you didn't do everything on your to-do list? Oh, today. And come to think of it, yesterday and the day before that. And the entire last week, I didn't finish anything on my to-do list. So why do we keep using this technique that's not working? It's not working because to-do list. What's that?
What would you suggest?
The answer is time boxing. That thousands of studies now have shown that making an implementation intention, which is just a fancy way of saying planning out what you're going to do and when you're going to do it, is the answer. And here's why it works so much better. You see, a to-do list is nothing but a list of output, okay? But if you want output, what do you need for output? You need input. So if you go to a baker and you say, I need you to output 100 loaves of bread, the baker will say, no problem. I need flour, I need sugar, I need yeast, I need salt, I need the input to make the output. But somehow when it comes to knowledge work, we think we'll just put the output on a magical list and it somehow gets done. No, I don't live in that magical universe. If you want output, you need input. So here's the thing. With a to-do list, you measure yourself by what you get done. With time boxing, the metric of success is not finishing anything. What? Let me say that again. The metric of success is not finishing anything. The metric of success is whether you did what you said you were going to do for as long as you said you were going to do it without distraction. Why is this so important? A big part of the book is about why identity change is behavior change and vice versa. Behavior change is identity change. What kind of identity are you cementing for your psyche when you don't finish everything on your to-do list? Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, you're telling yourself you're not the kind of person who does what they say they're going to do. And that's horrible for your sense of self-image, right? You're making it acceptable to not finish what you said you're going to do. You're basically lying to yourself. And by the way, I say this was me, right? I wrote this book for me. I used to do this all the time. And so that feeling is horrible to not finish what you say you're going to do. And more so, I would get home from work. And I call this the tyranny of the to-do list. How many times do you get home from work and all you want to do is just, watch a movie or hang out with your kids. And in the back of your mind is, oh, I didn't finish all those emails, or I didn't finish that assignment, or I didn't do this, or I didn't do this. Even the leisure time you have, you can't enjoy. Well, with this technique, that's gone. We don't do that anymore. What do we do instead? We decide in advance how we want to spend our time, not only the productive work time, but also the leisure time. And we measure ourselves based on whether we did what we said we were going to do without distraction for as long as we said we would. Because with every time block, whether it's 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, doesn't matter, now you won. With every time box that you did what you said you were going to do without distraction, you reinforce your identity that you live with personal integrity, that you did what you said you were going to do, that you are indistractable. And this is a life-changing practice. And there's a link, I built a tool online that anybody can access. It's completely free. It's at nirandfar.com/schedule-maker, nirandfar.com/schedule-maker. Anyone can use this free tool I made. You don't have to register for anything. The idea here is to turn your values into time. You know, so many of us, we talk a good game. We say, okay, what are my values? Oh, spending time with friends, working out, taking care of my health, focusing on my business. But if that time is not on your schedule, somebody's going to take up that time. Remember, we pay attention. So here's the mantra I want you to remember. You cannot call something a distraction unless you know what it distracted you from. Okay, let me say that again. You cannot call something a distraction unless you know what it distracted you from. If you have blank white space in your calendar, I don't want to hear complaints that you got distracted, because what did you get distracted from? Everything is a distraction if you don't decide in advance how you want to spend your time.
Nir, here's a couple of things, particularly we thought of a quick fire series of questions that pertain to you and the way that you think.
Yeah.
Which particular engineers or behavioral scientists do you really look up to and stimulate you? Just a quick answer.
Oh, so I was very inspired by BJ Fogg. I think the work of Dan Ariely is very inspiring. Albert Bandura. I mean, the list goes on and on. There's so many. Carol
Dan Ariely is obviously very well known in terms
Yep.
of looking at truth and trust.
Right. Carol Dweck is fantastic at Stanford as well.
How about Tristan Harris?
Not a fan. Not a fan. Not a fan. I think he's very, he puts all the blame on the tech companies. And I don't think that's a healthy place to start. That telling us that we're, he wrote this article that went viral about why technology is hijacking your brain.
Right.
And I think that is terribly offensive.
Right.
Hijacking is what they did to us on 9/11.
Right.
It's not Candy Crush, for God's sakes. And
That's
what we find is when we tell people this myth that technology is hijacking your brain, that it's addicting you, which is not true. It's not addicting the vast majority of people. Just like, look, let's use common sense here. Is alcohol addictive? Highly. Is everyone who drinks a glass of wine or beer with dinner an alcoholic? Of course not. Why would we say that technology is any different? These are wonderful tools. I mean, look what we're using right now. We're talking via thousands of miles apart. We're able to share this message with thousands of people, especially during this time of quarantine. Thank God we have these amazing technologies that keep us connected. So we need to stop this ridiculous blame game that accomplishes nothing. The tech companies are not going to make their products worse because we say, oh, you know what, Netflix, your shows are so engaging. I want to watch them too much. Apple, your devices are so new. I want to use them all the time. And so I think somebody just unmuted. Maybe Yash. Anyway, so I think that it's futile to blame the tech companies, especially when it leads to what we call learned helplessness. So when we tell people that technology is hijacking your brain, they believe it. And what do you do if you feel powerless? You stop trying. And so we need to stop this ridiculous messaging and realize that there's so much we can do. We can master the internal triggers, make time for traction, hack back the external triggers, and prevent distraction with packs. This is how we become indistractable.
Okay, so here's a question for you in our rapid fire quick question situation. The corona, obviously, and everyone locked down in India right now and around the world is presenting some really interesting challenges. We have literally hundreds of thousands of people in India that are studying coding, computer sciences, and so forth. Can you give some kind of sense as to what responsibilities do you think designers, computer engineers, behavioral scientists have for the next generation of what is going to be created, and especially so in a post-corona environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrote about this in Hooked, which was published in 2014. I wrote about the morality of manipulation. That these are techniques that we need to use carefully. That we need to make sure that we use them for good. And there's actually a very simple test. It's called the regret test. That there's two types of manipulation. There's what we call coercion and persuasion. Persuasion is simply helping people do things they want to do. And I can't think of a good reason why you wouldn't build products that help people exercise and educate and help make SaaS products better. I mean, nobody's brain is getting hijacked using enterprise software. I mean, give me a break. No, nobody's getting addicted to educational software. I wish they would. So, helping people persuade people to do things they themselves want to do is wonderful. We should use these techniques more. What is unethical is getting people to do things they regret, things they don't want to do. That's coercive, right? Getting people to do things they don't want to do. The nice thing is that for the vast majority of cases, I mean, it's very difficult to find cases where this isn't the case, that when people feel like they've been tricked, when we get them to do something they don't want to do, not only is that unethical, which I wrote about years ago, it's also bad business. That these days, if you make people do something they don't want to do, not only do they stop using your product, they tell all their friends on social media to stop using your product. People aren't stupid, right? And this isn't mind control. And so at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we are building the kind of products and services that meet people's needs and make the behaviors that they themselves want to do easier. This isn't trickery. This isn't mind control. This isn't manipulation. This isn't coercion. It's persuasion.
Here's an interesting question that we've got from one of our audience that has written in, wanting to find out what you can do with kids aged between 2 and 6 and looking at screens sometimes as an alternative babysitting device. What would your advice be about breeding new screenagers at that young age?
Well, I think the metaphor here is pools. That there's swimming pools can be very dangerous. And you wouldn't let a child just walk into the pool without supervision. And so why would we think that an iPad can be an iNanny? I don't know who thinks that's a good idea. With any form of media, I wouldn't let my child, just because technology is new, that's what we ask about. I wouldn't let my 11-year-old walk into a library and read just any book. There are lots of books that she's not ready for. And so we have to make sure that whatever media we expose our children to, that it is age appropriate, just like we would make sure that a child knows how to swim before we let them go into the pool.
Right. Yes,
I will say that this is the skill of the century, though, that if we do not train our children, if we do not educate them to become indistractable, they're at a real disadvantage. That I really believe that the world is bifurcating into two types of people. People who let their time and attention and their lives be controlled and manipulated by others, and people who stand up and say, no, I am indistractable. I decide how I control my time and attention. And, this is really going to be the skill of the century, because look, if you think the world is distracting now, just wait a few years. Our children's world is going to be even more distracting. And so that's
you're so right. You're so right in saying that. Here's a quote that you actually made. I do think that learning to become indistractable, to control your attention and choose your life, is the skill of the century, exactly as you'd said. Because if we think the world is distracting now, just wait a few years when we've got augmented reality, virtual reality, and goodness knows what else. I do think there's a bifurcation occurring between people who can control their attention and people who let their attention to be controlled. It's a vital skill. Is that a vital skill of leadership, a vital skill of education, a vital skill of government? What do you think would be at least some pointer that you can give, whether it's to parents or to, let's say, chief ministers of the states of India, or let's say to educational people, or even engineers that are developing things? When we said that we had a question from Vishal Gondal, who's a great innovator in India, talking about the evil of behavioral science and so forth, what do you think you can say is going to be at least some guideline that is a reliable one?
The message is that we can do this. That if there's one thing I want everyone listening to remember, and if you were to summarize my work over the past 5 years into one sentence, it's that the antidote to impulsiveness is forethought. So I'm not talking to the institutions, I'm talking to the individuals. And I'm telling you that the gift that evolution has bestowed on our species is that we can see into the future with higher fidelity than any other creature on the face of the earth. We know what will happen. We can predict what will happen better than any other animal. And we should use that gift. Here's how. If you wait for the chocolate cake to be on the fork, you're going to eat it. If you wait till the cigarette is in your hand lit, you're going to smoke it. If you sleep next to your cell phone every night, it's going to be the first thing you reach for in the morning because you've already lost. The idea here is to not wait for government to fix this problem. It's not to wait for these companies to make their products less engaging. That's never going to happen. The idea here is not even to use willpower and self-control. The people I interviewed who are indistractable, they don't have a large amount of willpower and self-control. What they have is a system. The antidote to impulsiveness is forethought. They think ahead. They act today to make sure they don't get distracted tomorrow.
Well, just really fascinating. And I'm glad that we've tried to answer some of these questions. Now, here's something interesting. There's a group in the United States that have started something called the Algorithmic Justice League. And this is something that I know a lot of computer scientists and behavioral scientists look at when algorithms are created, but sometimes have a bias. And this was done by an incredible woman in America by the name of Joy Buolamwini, who found that certain algorithms were inequitable to people of color. So if you were not white and you were brown or you were black or you were, say, Asian, sometimes the algorithms, and this came about with facial recognition systems, and she decided to form something called the Algorithmic Justice League to be able to make sure that engineers and behavioral scientists made software that actually was equitable. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's terrific. We do also need to understand and recognize that technology does not live in a vacuum, that algorithms can absolutely be biased. And guess what? People can be biased. And so if the alternative, that doesn't mean that algorithms are bad, because people can be very biased as well. In fact, in many ways, I would much rather have an algorithm that I can change much quicker than I can change a human being's mind. And so in many ways, I think algorithms have the potential to help us make more unbiased decisions and lead to a much more just world.
So Nir, just a couple of tactical tips. If you had undergraduate or people that are at college or at university in India that are thinking about getting into behavioral science, and you've mentioned some of the names of the people that you look up to, if you could give just a couple of tactical tips of what areas they should focus on, obviously psychology, psychiatry, can you think of anything within that discipline of behavioral science that might be a tip to some student in India that is thinking about how to basically grow into that field?
Sure. Yeah. So my background is in psychology, technology, and business. That's really what where behavioral design lives. So it's really, behavioral economics. It's about the Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler and Amos and Tversky.
Hold on a second. Cass Sunstein is who?
He's a leader in this field of behavioral economics as well. So
Wow.
Understanding behavioral economics is a huge pillar. Psychology, consumer psychology specifically, and product design. So if you understand how to build great products, because behavioral design, as opposed to the more theoretical end, behavioral design is only effective in that it changes behavior. So you have to have some kind of user experience, or it doesn't count. That's the end goal, is to change behavior.
Okay, so here's a quick answer, quick question.
Sure.
In terms of design, tell us good, bad, or indifferent. Instagram, good or bad or indifferent?
It's all about how you use it, right? If it's something, what's that?
When Kevin Systrom designed it, what design? Good, bad, yeah.
Design from a behavioral design perspective, it's very well designed. Now, if it's good or bad for you is based on whether you use it with intent or if it's done out of a distraction.
I was thinking of it from a design standpoint.
So very well designed, amazingly well designed, very habit forming.
WhatsApp.
Also very well designed.
Jan Koum probably never realized that it would have such a widespread use, particularly in India, where it is absolutely massive. Can you think of any others that, like, for example, Airbnb is a good design. In fact, the founders of Airbnb were from the Rhode Island School of Design in Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island in America. Any other ones that come to mind to you that reflect great behavioral design?
Sure. I think the elephant in the room is Facebook. I think they've done an amazing job. I mean, Zuckerberg understands what makes people tick and what makes people click probably better than anyone on the face of the earth. You know, everybody knows that Zuckerberg dropped out of Harvard and he was a computer science major. What many people don't realize that he was actually a double major before he dropped out, that his other major was psychology. That Kevin Systrom's was a symbolic systems major at Stanford. Symbolic systems is the intersection of psychology and technology. So, you know, Reid Hoffman as well, you know, LinkedIn, Netflix. Of course, we talked about Slack, all of these companies, both in the enterprise and the consumer web space. You know, these days, if you cannot form a habit with a consumer, you're really leaving a tremendous opportunity on the table. And it doesn't necessarily have to be online businesses. I mean, I even talk about how, you know, a barbershop can become a habit forming product. If you always go to the same barber, that can also become a habit where you don't even think about the competition. Oh, we didn't mention Google. I think Google has done an amazing job. And, you know, this is a fact. We know that Larry Page, when he looks at businesses to invest in, he has what he calls the toothbrush test. That he doesn't want to invest in any product that isn't used with the kind of frequency and habituation of using a toothbrush twice a day.
Well, maybe we'll have to develop the Dal Makhani test for India. Those of you in India know exactly what Dal Makhani is. And Nir, maybe at some point, you and I and Yash Akashi and his entire TEDx Gateway team will be able to share a Dal Makhani and more stories and more wonderful, wonderful knowledge that you've brought. So Nir, first of all, we'd like to say a massive thanks to you on behalf of everybody at TEDx Gateway. To all those of you way across India, we've had a fantastic audience on today's session of the TEDx Gateway webinar. Thanks to those of you from Australia that have keyed in, from London, from Europe, from the Nordics, from Helsinki, from the East Coast of America, where it's still early in the morning. We don't know how many from the West Coast, because there it's probably 5:30 a.m. But Nir Eyal, a big, big thanks to you for really bringing great insight from all that you've done. We wish you lots of success with your book, Indistractable. We hope it's indestructible.
Thank you.
And we hope that you'll come to India so that we can be graced by what you see. And a lot of the corporates that have been watching understand that this key area that you're in and the way that you think is something, this great, great blend between psychology, design, and business is a holy trinity that can really lead to successful lives, successful business, and successful and productive ways of using the future. So once again, we'd like to say the world is changing. Change the way you see it. And Nir, this is what it is in Hindi. Dunya badal rahi hai, apne nazariye ko bhi badlo. Nir, thank you, thank you, thank you. Bahut dhanyavad.
Thank you.
That's right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Nir. It was amazing. We had thousands of people across Facebook, Twitter, and of course on Zoom. And I'm sure each one of us is wondering, how do we best focus to our attention and make sure that we make most out of our time that we have? And of course, this was a crash course for parents. I'm sure they're going to learn so much more in helping their kid focus on things and not get distracted by these apps and iPads. So thank you again.
That forest was really good, wasn't it?
Yeah. Thank you again. And I would love to thank the team that made it possible. And do join us next week for our series of webinars. We have an interesting webinar with Naveen Jain and Dr. Momo Visich from Wyoming. They're going to be talking about the gut and the science behind the gut, and especially how is it important in the current pandemic that you're seeing around, and how can we strengthen our immunity through the gut. And we have a special speaker on Sunday that will be releasing soon. Thank you again. Please share your feedback, and thanks to Ralph and Nir again for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye. See you. Take care.